Hey there, folks. Welcome to the Whitfield Report Thursday edition. I am your host, Sam Whitfield, recording from NGC Studios here in South Florida. And I want to thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the podcast. And I'm recording this on my iPad with the Samson Q2U microphone that I got. Many of you have left positive feedback saying that the new microphone sounded great on my computer and also on the YouTube live stream that I did last night to demonstrate it. So I really appreciate all the feedback that I've gotten on the mic. It certainly makes the money that I spent on the mic and the adapter for the iPad worth it. Well, hopefully for the iPad. I'm testing it out right now. Done a couple test recordings and it seems pretty good. So this is the actual podcast. But at any rate, as you guys know, the Thursday podcast is more or less the political, free-for-all podcast in terms of whatever pops into my mind, I kind of cover. So, last week, a lot of you were wondering if I had heard the Joe Rogan podcast with Dan Crenshaw, and a couple of you guys wanted me to cover that in the Facebook group for the Whitfield Report, and a couple other places on Twitter were saying that I should, listen to that. So I did, and let me just say right off the bat that I thought the interview was pretty good, for the most part. And this is something I want to dive in here immediately to kind of cover. But there seems to be this new, kind of criticism of Joe Rogan out there that I don't necessarily know if it's warranted, but the criticism is that Joe is kind of a, he's kind of a shill and he kind of tries to, please whoever his guest is. And that's been one of, a pretty consistent criticism that he has. That he doesn't really take, sides and he doesn't really make his opinions known. That's kind of been like a criticism that I've heard from people regarding Joe Rogan over the last couple of years. And I know what I'm about to say is probably going to make me sound like a complete Joe Rogan fanboy, which, I mean, in a way I am. I disagree with Rogan on some issues. He's obviously into complete universal, healthcare by the government. I just don't think that's going to work. He's pretty socially liberal, whereas, I'm more of a social libertarian, and I mean, so is he, actually, so, I guess we have that in common. But, point being is, a lot of people criticize Joe Rogan unfairly sometimes. It's funny, the people on the right tend to think that Joe is kind of a shill for the left and that he's kind of being a mamby-pamby and that he has, no cojones whatsoever. And then people on the left criticize Rogan for, having on conservative commentators and giving a platform to alt-right neo-Nazis, quote-unquote. And, I don't think either side really understands what it is that Joe Rogan does on his podcast. And again, this is going to maybe sound like me, trying to defend Rogan or being like a complete shill for him. And I'm not. This is just kind of my, this is my interpretation of his show. For better or for worse, Joe seems to be one of the few major public figures and one of the few major interviewers who takes time to sit down with both sides of, not only of the political spectrum, but he talks to everyone from all different walks of life and all different areas and, areas of academia and professions and basically anything you can imagine. He basically interviews, everyone and likes to just have conversations. And this is why I'm a fan of Joe Rogan. He's a conversationalist. He'll talk to everyone. And in today's news media and in today's internet culture, and I'm, guilty of this somewhat too, people tend to think that if you're not taking a particular, stance on things when interviewing someone or when having a conversation with someone, that you're just trying to shill them or suck up to them, right? So I'll give you a perfect example. Joe Rogan had Bernie Sanders on about 2 weeks ago, or probably 3 weeks ago now, by the time you guys are listening to this. But anyway, the criticism of the Bernie Sanders interview that I saw from a lot of conservatives wasn't about Bernie so much. It was, Rogan's having on Bernie Sanders, ergo, he's, a socialist, namby-pamby, just a pot-smoking douchebag, right? That was kind of the reaction from the reactionary right somewhat in terms of Joe having Bernie on. But then let's also go to when Joe had Alex Jones on earlier this year. Right? Like him or not, Alex Jones is an interesting, person. He has some interesting views. Agree with them or disagree with them, he is certainly an interesting character. And I've said this again, and I'll continue. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. The censorship by the big platforms of Alex Jones is wrong, right? So Joe was, I felt, did a very good thing by having Alex on, right? To kind of explain his side of things, for the second time and just talk about some issues and whatnot. The reaction from the left regarding, Rogan having on Alex Jones for that second time, it was basically, Joe Rogan gave a platform to a neo-Nazi, right? That was one of the literal headlines from, I think it was Slate magazine that wrote a blog post pretty much saying that Alex Jones is a neo-Nazi in their opinion, so therefore, by Joe Rogan having Alex Jones on, he was giving a platform to a neo-Nazi, and therefore Joe Rogan endorses neo-Nazism, right? Which is crazy. And, on the flip side, with Rogan having Bernie on, the right was saying that Rogan, endorses Bernie and that he's a complete, socialist. Now, like I said in the beginning of the podcast, I know that Rogan is more socially liberal than I am, but I mean, he's not a full-blood communist either. He certainly has a very hard work ethic. I mean, he's built the number one most downloaded podcast of all time. He is big into the Second Amendment. And like I said, he likes to try and understand both sides of the story, right? And this is something because we're so partisan now, because of social media and because of kind of the way things are in the information age, people expect you to take one side or the other. So I preface the Joe Rogan interview, or the interviews, right? I brought up the Alex Jones case of Joe being demonized by the left as, an alt-right, and then I brought up Bernie as an example of Joe being demonized as a commie by the right. Okay, so last week, Joe has Dan Crenshaw on. Now, Dan Crenshaw is kind of getting flack from both the left and the right, which we'll get here to in a sec. But it's interesting because Joe was criticized by the right for having Crenshaw on because they feel that Crenshaw is now like a McCain rhino. And then you have the left complaining at Joe for having Crenshaw on because Crenshaw is a right-wing gun nut, according to the left. Right? So those are kind of the two, juxtapositions that Dan Crenshaw is in the middle of, right? And, being more specific, people seem to be harping on the gun, talk portion of the JRE podcast, which I'll get to in a few moments because that seems to be what a lot of people are focused. But I want to just dive into kind of the overall view, the overall conversation that Crenshaw had with Rogan. I did not know a lot about Dan Crenshaw prior to this interview. Like, I knew he was a Navy SEAL. I knew he got wounded. I knew he's a Republican from Texas. But basically, that's pretty much all I knew, like a lot of people. I don't think I was particularly alone in that. So when Crenshaw won Rogan, I took it as an opportunity to listen to the whole interview. And, look at Crenshaw as a whole. And what I found was Crenshaw is a guy who, in my opinion, genuinely does want to serve the country, and who genuinely has good intention for wanting to be a representative Texas. Right? Two issues that I agreed with him immediately on is the fact that censorship with the media and the big social platforms is bad, and that we might have to look into maybe breaking up the monopoly of the big tech companies so that they can have a stranglehold on our democracy. But he also admitted it's a challenge because they are a private company and we don't want to regulate them too much. So Crenshaw and I agree completely on that. And, we also agreed that while I'm not a big fan of the military still being over there in the Middle East, I don't think that there will ever really be a point that we can't not be over there at some point, just because of all the terrorist groups kind of still harassing our allies somewhat. I don't think we need to be there in a war capacity, certainly. But I certainly think at this point, not having military bases there is kind of an impossibility. So those were two things that I agreed with Crenshaw. Okay. Now, the big criticism that Crenshaw has faced is, and this is specifically what a lot of people seem to focus on, was this idea of the TAP Act. Now, the way Crenshaw words this, it wouldn't be the same as a red flag law, but it would essentially give local law enforcement a way to use data and analytics from, past murder cases to kind of try and systematically curtail violent crimes where they can. A lot of people seem to misunderstand this as the same thing as a direct red flag law, which is what the left is essentially proposing, where your neighbor can, basically rat you out if you have weapons and whatnot of any kind, or if you're even suspected, okay? That's what the left want. They want extreme, background checks. They basically want to disarm the population, the far, far left. What Crenshaw is actually proposing with giving the data and analytics, I think, is he wants to give local law enforcement a better grip on, possibly studying the crime statistics so that they can maybe prepare strategies to go into violent areas. Okay, now, the libertarian part of me says that this is a bad idea because giving more authority to the state, and giving more authority to law enforcement is, not for liberty. So, on the one hand, I don't like that. But then the pragmatist side of me, which is what I'm kind of siding with, this is kind of where I draw the line too with the libertarians. I get the idea that like more regulation and giving the police more power isn't necessarily always a good idea, but I would also argue that it really depends on the situation, right? In this case, Crenshaw seems to be giving some more tools that the federal government might have to local law enforcement agencies for community, right? Now, I have always made the stipulation that there is a big difference between the authority in your local community and the authority of the state, right? Officers within the community in your town, they know the citizenry a little bit better. You might have, a cop as a neighbor or a close friend. They tend to know you a bit better. And I actually know some police officers who are very libertarian in their ideas, how they kind of live their lives, and they want liberty. There are libertarian police officers. And this is the other problem, not to get up on a sign right here, but this is another problem when we talk about, gun control and cops and everything else. When it comes to police officers, libertarians tend to generally demonize police officers as like evil, horrible monsters, when really a lot of them are just, trying to do their job. Yes, there are corrupt cops out there, who are corrupt and who are bad and who do cause problems for the the legal system. But more often than not, the police officers as individuals, they are human, they do make mistakes. But I feel that the average police officer, the average detective, especially the average homicide detective, really wants to see justice done and they want to do the right thing. The problem isn't with the individual officers most of the time when it comes to law enforcement. The problem is with the politicians and the higher ups within the police department, kind of the guidelines and the politics of police. Right? This is something that Michael Connolly explores a lot in his Bosch, to say, hey, it's not just about, police officers and the detectives. A lot of the time, politics gets in the way of police work. And so when libertarians get mad at, police officers and whatnot, I always try and remind them, you're not actually mad at the officer, as an individual. You're most likely mad at the policy that they're being forced to enforce. Right? So, in terms of Crenshaw wanting to give this data to local law enforcement agencies, I don't really see the problem, honestly, because in my mind, and obviously, this isn't going to be perfect, but if local law enforcement, could have, better access to some of these things on the local level, they might be able to, perhaps, check in on a troubled individual, who's legitimately troubled, right? The Florida shooter last year who shot up that high school, right? Cops visited him a couple of times, said that he was obviously troubled, but they couldn't really do anything because they were all cops and they didn't have the resources to do anything, right? And yet this guy, through his actions, was clearly infringing on, other people's liberty. And then when he, committed that shooting, he obviously went to the most extreme, right? So Crenshaw's act that he's proposing, as I understand it, focuses mainly on local law enforcement and giving them more power. But Crenshaw has also said, and I think this is important, that, giving the federal government more power over firearms is a big no-no, right? So the right is criticizing Crenshaw for, being quote-unquote too, restrictive on gun rights and basically being a shill like McCain, which we'll get to that here in a sec as well. And then the left is criticizing him for not doing enough and, being too lenient on gun laws, right? Because Dan Crenshaw is a Republican and the left is stereotyping. Like I said, I see this whole thing as a middle ground, and this goes back to my earlier, critique of the whole reaction that we had to gun violence in American society. We can't take 10 minutes to grieve as a society whenever these shootings happen, like in El Paso or like, in Dayton, Ohio, right? We have to politicize things immediately rather than taking the time to, grieve and really sort things out. We can't, just grieve as a nation for 5 minutes, which I'm using that kind of as a metaphor. And in reality, we can't even go for like a full month or a full 2 weeks without, one of these tragedies becoming political, which is really sad. It really is. So where do I come down on the whole Crenshaw, gun violence thing? Look, here's where I don't like the, there are parts of the TAPS Act that I don't like. I wish that he would be a little bit more detailed on exactly what parameters he wants to give local law enforcement and whatnot. But his proposal is a lot better than what the far left is proposing, which is basically ban, guns everywhere, and they want, everyone being like, surveilled and whatnot. So there is a fine line, and I believe that Crenshaw is trying to do his best to, walk the line between those. Overall, though, the podcast behind his history and whatnot was very interesting. With Rogan, and I think he did an overall pretty good job regarding his appearance on Rogan's podcast. Now, as far as the name calling goes, with some people like calling him the new John McCain or whatever, honestly, I think that's a little, it's a little early to be making statements like that. I don't think he's at the level of, John McCain. Yeah, in terms of, being a total neocon. For Christ's sake, he's only been a representative 7 months, and while he is still a politician, and while he's not necessarily immune to criticism, I do generally like to point out that he is still relatively new, and that, hey, for one, I think we still ought to give him a chance somewhat to really, do some stuff in office and really see where he goes. Who knows, this TAPS Act thing may be his way to kind of like placate the Dems a little in Congress. That like, hey, I'm doing something's being proposed and whatnot. But I don't think he's going far left on this at all. Certainly, it doesn't seem like it to me. So, that's kind of my whole take on Crenshaw and the, the whole gun control debate. Like I said, it's sad that we have to politicize these, these things. And, I wish society were more, were willing to step back more or less whenever these mass shootings happened, and I ultimately something is probably going to happen down the line with gun control. I hate to say it, but and this is the other thing: we're nowhere near repealing every single gun law in the country, which is what the libertarians want. So Crenshaw, in my opinion, is trying to keep the left from getting what they really want, which is complete, gun confiscation. And Crenshaw is proposing alternatives to that, I feel. He also explains pretty well on his YouTube channel what the TAPS Act actually is, and he says that he feels a lot of people are misunderstanding, so maybe go check that out. I think he's, I think it's worth watching. The other thing I do like about him is he is a bit more nuanced and actually kind of explains his positions relatively well compared to most other politicians. Most politicians don't even really communicate via social media all that well at all in general, but he seems to actually take the time to address some of the concerns of his constituents, and and he even said on a recent video, hey, look, I know some of you guys have concerns and criticism regarding the TAPS Act, so here's what it actually is. And he took the time on a YouTube video to explain his position on that, which I think is awesome. So, and And I wish more politicians would do that. But anyway, that will do it for this episode. We're about 30 minutes in. Can't really think of anything else to chat about for this podcast. But anyway, I want to thank you all for listening to this episode of the Whitfield Report. I really appreciate each and every one of you listening, and I'm anxious to hear your feedback on how the new mic sounded on the iPad setup. It sounds pretty good so far to me. Obviously, you guys will hear the post-production result. But anyway, folks, from all of us here at NGC, have a good day, good evening, or a good afternoon, whenever you're listening to this in the past, present, future hour. And I will see you guys for the Saturday edition of the Whitfield Report live on YouTube at 10 p.m. I will be having Sean and Phil from the Versa News show on to basically promote their show and discuss some other topics. So I was on their show a couple months ago, so now I've decided to return the favor, and they're always fun to talk to, and so it should be a good pod. Alright, folks, from all of us at NGC1, God, freedom, legacy in that order, God bless, and God save this great nation. Thanks for listening to the Whitfield Report, and I'll see you on Saturday. Hey there, folks. If you've made it this far to the end of the podcast, I'd like to thank you very much for listening to the show. You are the ones that make it possible for me to make an income from podcasting, and I greatly appreciate that just by listening to our show. You are helping us gain ad revenue. However, if you would really like to help support the show, I encourage you to please donate to the podcast and become a supporter of the show. You can head over to anchor.fm/Whitfield Report and click the support this podcast button and choose the amount that suits you to support the show. Or you can click the link in the show notes and it will directly take you to that page. If you can support the podcast, I really, really appreciate that. Anything that you can do to help out is greatly appreciated. Even if you can't afford to help financially support the podcast, I encourage you to please go on iTunes or Apple Podcasts or Stitcher and please leave this podcast a positive 5-star review. That really helps us out here at the Whitfield Report. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next episode.